In requirement number 4, the client has asked us to determine the total cost of assets purchased by asset category that were purchased in 2014. To do this, we're going to use a new tool. It's similar to the slicer tool, except this is called the timeline tool. In the timeline tool, we'll be able to sort the data by years. We could sort it in more granular data also by months and in more than 1 month and more than 1 year. So let's take a look at how to create a pivot table to identify the total cost of assets purchased in 2014 by asset category. We're going to begin by creating a pivot table that will show the total cost by asset category. So again, I will click on my insert. I'll insert a pivot table. We'll use the defaults and we'll set up a new pivot table for requirement number 4. Okay, so I'm going to create a pivot table and it needs to show the total cost by asset category. So in the rows area, I'm going to pull down my asset category, and then I want the total cost. So I'm going to pull down cost into the values area. So now I have asset category and total cost. Now I'm going to, let's just format this so that it's a little easier to read. Okay, so now I've created the pivot table, so now I need to be able to sort this information so that I can identify the cost of assets purchased by asset category in 2014. So I'll use the timeline tool to get the 2014 portion of it. So on the Analyze tab, I'm going to click on Insert Timeline. This allows me to filter dates. And we're going to filter by the in-service date. That would be the date that it was purchased. So I'll select that and then I'll click OK. So now this gives me a timeline of which I can filter. So for example, I can scroll over and I can say, okay, well, what assets did I purchase in 2013 in December? Looks like I didn't purchase anything then. So we want to do it by years. So we're going to change the default, which is months. We're going to come over here and we're going to change it to years. And so now you can see that it's given me my years. And I'm going to select 2014 only. And this is going to provide me with the total cost of assets purchased in 2014 by asset categories. So I purchased approximately $2.5 million of furniture and $12 million of land improvements in 2014. Notice the data gets refreshed every time I select a different year. In requirement number 5, it asks you to determine how much equipment was purchased in the Northeast in 2008. So again, we're going to start by creating a pivot table, and we're going to need to build a pivot table that shows total cost by asset category and also by asset region. And we're going to use the timeline tool to narrow it down to 2008. Now again, I want to remind you that the data that your professor might be asking for is different than the data that you're going to use in this video. In this video, we're looking at Northeast in 2008. Your professor might ask you to answer a different type of question, but you'll be able to use the same steps to get to the answer. For requirement number 5, we're again going to begin by creating a pivot table. So we will come and click on Insert. We'll insert our pivot table. We'll use the defaults, and then we're going to rename our sheet for requirement number 5. Now this requirement asks us how much equipment was purchased in the Northeast in a specific year in 2008. So we need to begin by creating a pivot table that shows the total cost. So I'm going to bring my cost down into my summation area. So that will get me my total cost. And then I'm going to need to show it by asset category. So I'll bring that down by my rows. Okay, so now I have my asset category and I have my cost. I also need this to be by region areas. So I want to think about how I want to do that. I could use my regions as my columns. So then I've got my asset categories on the left and I have my regions on the right. I could also change it so that it looks a little differently. Let me show you what that looks like. So I'm going to bring my regional areas down for my rows, and I'll bring my asset categories over for my columns. I like that look a little better. It's easier for me to read it this way. So I've got regions on the left, and I have asset categories on the right. Okay, I'm going to format it just to make it easy here to read. Okay, so now this says how much equipment was purchased in the Northeast in 2008. Okay, so I can answer the Northeast part of it by filtering so that we only show Northeast. So I'm going to do that by simply clicking on my drop-down arrow. I'm going to select only Northeast, and then that's going to show me just my Northeast information. But now I need to figure out how much equipment was purchased in the Northeast in 2008. Okay, so I'm still showing all of my assets over here, so I'm going to filter for my assets by clicking the drop down for columns, selecting only equipment. Okay, so this is the total of equipment purchased in the Northeast for all years. Now I need to only see 2008. So we're going to utilize what we did in requirement number 4. We're going to insert that timeline tool. And we'll do that by clicking into our pivot table and then clicking on Analyze. We'll go Insert Timeline. We're going to do it by In-Service Date. And then remember, it defaults to months. I want to do it by years, so I'll select years. And then I want to know, what did we purchase for equipment in 2008? And so I'll select 2008, and it looks like for this data set, we purchased $8,750 for equipment in the Northeast region. In requirement number 6, the problem is asking us to determine what the total cost of assets purchased are by category for all assets before 2005. So this is similar to requirement number 5, except now we're looking at total cost of assets, and we need it by category, but we only want to see those that are purchased before 2005. We're going to create a similar pivot table, but we're going to use the timeline tool again, but we're going to modify it to prior to 2005. In requirement number 6, we're going to begin by creating a pivot table that shows the total costs by asset category. So again, I'll go to Insert, Pivot Table, use the defaults, create a new sheet called Requirement 6. Okay, so now I want to create my pivot table. So my pivot table is going to be asset category. So I'll take asset category and I'll drag it down into rows. And then I need total cost. So I'll drag that down into my values. So now I have asset category by total cost. Okay, so let me just format it. Okay. Now I need to show those assets that were purchased before 2005. So I'm going to use my timeline tool to get that. So I want to point out something here. When I click out of the data, out of the pivot table, you'll notice that my pivot table information goes away, and I also don't have my Analyze button up here anymore. Once you click back into the pivot table, those fields all come back. So to insert the timeline, we're going to click Analyze. We'll say Insert Timeline. We want to do it by in-service date, so we'll select that. And we'll say OK. OK, so now this shows me that I can modify the pivot table by in-service date. I want to do it by years, so I'll select years. And I'm going to scroll over because I want all years prior to 2005. So notice that if I just attempt to click on these, it just simply selects the specific year. If I come through and I move to the right-hand corner and then drag, it will select multiple years. So this is the answer for my data set. It looks like we purchased equipment, $2,150 for 2001 to 2004. Now notice if I wanted to verify that, I could verify that by double checking it by checking to see what my in-service date is. Now I can, if you don't have years yet in your pivot table, you can bring in-service date down into the columns. And that's going to show you that this was purchased in 2001. I can open it up further and see that it was purchased in Q2 and it was purchased in April. If you already have years selected, then you can simply just bring the years down. Let me show you how that works. So here's my years already set up for me. I can bring the years down and it will simply filter it by years. So lots of different ways to create these pivot tables as you get more and more accomplished with them. Requirement number 7 asks you to prepare a pivot table that shows the book value of the furniture category by region. And then you're going to prepare a pivot chart using the column chart type for that specific information. Okay, so again, we're going to do a pivot table. It needs to show book value of furniture by region. Again, we're going to begin by creating a pivot table. We'll select Insert, Pivot Table, use the defaults, rename our worksheet to Requirement 7. Okay, this pivot table needs to show ending book value by asset category and region. So what we're going to do is we're going to take our region and we're going to pull that down into our rows. So that's going to show us our regions. Then we're going to need to show our columns are going to be asset category. So I'll pull that down over into my asset category. And I want to show ending book value. Show the ending book value by asset category, got it, and by regions, got it. So I'm going to select ending book value as what we're going to show, which will be my values. So now we can see we've got the ending book value by regions and asset categories. Now this requirement asks you to show the ending book value of furniture by region. Okay, so we're going to need to narrow the pivot table down so that it only shows furniture. I'll do that by selecting my column labels drop-down arrow. I'll select only furniture and click OK. So now we see just the furniture for the different regions. Now we're ready to create our column chart. So we're going to prepare a pivot chart. We'll click on the Analyze tab and we'll select Pivot Chart. I'm going to select the column type of chart, and I'm going to select the clustered chart. So notice here's the different areas. We'll select, in my screen, it's the first one, the clustered chart. And I'll say OK. Okay, so now let's make sure that this was pulled up correctly. So it's furniture, it's by regional area, and it's showing me my values. So that's the answer to requirement number 7.